Welcome to the Food Junkies Podcast. Here, we aim to bring you the experience, strength, and hope of professionals working on the front lines in the field of food addiction. Our mission is to educate you, the listener, and increase overall awareness about food addiction as a recognized disorder. Here, we discuss all things recovery, exploring the many pathways people take towards abstinence in order to achieve a health-forward lifestyle. We hope to inspire you to thrive rather than just survive. So stay positive, make a change for yourself, and share your journey with others. And hopefully the message will spread.
Eating disorders, food addiction. What is the difference? Welcome to the Food Junkies Podcast. My name is Dr. Vera Tarman, and I am your co-host today along with Clarrisa Kennedy. Today, we are speaking with Dr. Cynthia Bulik, who presents a radical view of eating disorders, one that might give us common ground to work together. Dr. Cynthia Bulik is a clinical psychologist and one of the world's leading experts on eating disorders. She is the founding director of the University of North Carolina Center of Excellence for Eating Disorders and of the Center for Eating Disorders Innovation at Karolinska Institutet in Stockholm, Sweden. Dr. Bulik is Distinguished Professor of Eating Disorders in the Department of Psychiatry at UNC, Professor of Nutrition in the Gillings School of Global Public Health, and Professor of Medical Epidemiology and Biostatistics at Karolinska University. Dr. Bulik has received numerous awards for her pioneering work, including Lifetime Achievement Awards from the National Eating Disorders Association, the Academy for Eating Disorders, and the International Society of Psychiatric Genetics. She has written over 750 scientific papers and books aimed at educating the public about eating disorders. Currently, Dr. Bulik's focus is on the reconceptualization of eating disorders as being a set of metapsychiatric diseases. Food Junkies is keen to explore this interest and how metabolic disease can play a role in disordered eating, and can this construct be our common ground to start understanding the muddy waters between eating disorders and food addiction. Welcome, Dr. Cynthia Bulik.
Thank you very much, Vera, and please call me Cindy.
Okay, thank you, Cindy. So tell us what got you interested into the field of eating disorders, and then how you started to think about it as a manifestation of metabolic disease.
Sure, happy to clarify that. Well, it was actually sort of serendipitous. I was asked to co-write a chapter actually about sleep EEGs and comparing sleep EEG and anorexia and depression. And I was working on child depression at the time and knew nothing about eating disorders. So I said, in order to write this chapter, I need to shadow an attending on an eating disorders unit, which I did. And sort of from that moment on, I was almost addicted to the field, since we're talking about addiction today. But I was fascinated by what I saw. And I had also been a competitive figure skater. And I realized, oh my God, this has been around me all my life, but I didn't know what it was. So my sports world and my academic world converged, and boom, there I was.
What is a sleep EEG?
So there's a whole bunch of research on how sleep electroencephalogram differs in people with depression versus people who aren't depressed. And the question was, do we see some of those similar changes in people with eating disorders? So I have not followed that line of work, but there are some folks coming out now who are looking at sleep disturbances in people with eating disorders as well.
How did you get from that to the discussion about metabolic? How did you come into that area?
It's been a long process. And, one of the things, and I'm going to dive right into my central thesis here, is that I think, and from what we've seen, both clinically and research-wise, people with anorexia nervosa respond differently to negative energy balance than other healthy people do. And so I'll take a minute. Negative energy balance is basically when you're expending more energy than you're consuming. And most of us don't like that state. So if we're in negative energy balance, we get hangry and we get irritable and we start foraging for food. But people who are predisposed to anorexia say that, at baseline, they're pretty anxious, irritable people. And when they're in negative energy balance, they feel better. They feel calmer. And in my head, I was like, no, this is not what the sociocultural theories have been saying. There's something else going on here. And that's when I really started looking at how can we figure out what this is, and does metabolism play a role in eating disorders?
I know that you have some work in genetics. It seems to me that you're implying that there's something genetically different about anorexics.
Exactly. So we started out doing twin studies and family studies. We showed that eating disorders run in families. We showed in twin studies that the reason they run in families is genetics. And then finally, we've moved on to genome-wide association studies where we can actually identify the regions in the genome that are implicated in various disorders like anorexia, bulimia, etc., food addiction as well. And the biggest study that we've done so far, and we can talk about this in more depth later, but it has shown that not only are there genetic psychiatric factors that are implicated in anorexia, but there's a whole panel of metabolic and anthropometric factors. Again, genetic metabolic factors that involved as well. And that's where we came up with the term metabopsychiatric disorder to capture both of those sources of genetic influence.
Okay, so let's back up a little bit. And you come from an eating disorder paradigm. So give what the traditional is and then how your approach is very different.
Yeah, I almost don't want to talk about the traditional because we're trying to move away from it, but I will because I think so many people still believe it. And the main sort of erroneous assumption was that eating disorders were somehow a choice, that it was driven by, young women desiring to be thin and attractive, and then it sort of like got out of control. And that meant that it was a willful choice to not eat.
Or a coping mechanism.
Sure. And that's the third piece, right? The second piece, and this is the most damaging, was that families were somehow involved. And of course, the mother was the one who was blamed, and that somehow like psychosomatic families engendered anorexia nervosa. But, from my clinical experience, I've never seen a typical family. Anorexia pops up all over the place. There's no pattern. And then the third one was this issue of control. And, it's like, the one thing she can control is her, what she puts into her mouth. And it's a face valid explanation, but it's a simplistic explanation, and it's not enough. And that's why I have just sort of eschewed these and said, let's figure out what's going on here biologically.
Okay, well, I'd like you to explain what's going on biologically, but you said that people are moving away from this traditional model. Is that really true?
I hope so. We're pushing it. We're trying really hard. I mean, if you sit next to me on an airplane, I'm going to help you move away from that model. And I think people, even folks who are sort of card-carrying sociocultural theorists at this point will put things in like, and genes seem to play a role. So I think we've sort of woven ourselves into the fabric of how people think about the genetic component to eating disorders. And it's not everything. It's not 100% genetic. I'm not denying that culture plays a role and that choice plays a role in recovery, especially. But we do need to make sure that genetics is part of the picture always.
Okay, so please explain what the genetics and biological factors are, if you can flesh it out a little bit for us.
Sure. So how about if I just explain a little bit about what a genome-wide association study is?
Yeah, sure.
So the way we do these studies is we get large samples, tens and hundreds of thousands of people with a particular illness. And I'll talk about anorexia first. And we compare them to tens or hundreds of thousands of people without the illness. And we get like some saliva or some blood, and we genotype it, and we get a full readout of their genomes. And then, through statistical magic, we compare the genomes of people with anorexia versus people without anorexia. And we ask the question, where do the differences lie? And where those differences lie, and we have a super high threshold for significance, so we want to make sure we don't have false positives. Then we identify regions that are implicated in risk for anorexia, bulimia, binge eating disorder. And so far, we have identified 8 regions on the human genome that are implicated in anorexia, but we can take it one step further. And this is where the interesting part really emerged. And that is, we can actually ask, to what extent do the genes that influence anorexia, are they the same as genes that influence other traits? And so we call them genetic correlations. And we found very high positive genetic correlations between anorexia and obsessive compulsive disorder, anorexia and depression. And these things aren't surprising to us because clinically we see those co-occurring all the time.
Yeah.
But what it means is that positive genetic correlation is that the same genes are increasing risk for both of those disorders.
What about addiction? Do you see the correlation with addiction as well?
No, but just wait until we get down there to bulimia and binge eating disorder. That's where I think we're going to see differences. And I think we're going to see differences between anorexia and the other eating disorders. And addiction is going to be one of the areas where those differences emerge. So that's a super great question. And have me back next year and we'll have answers for you. How does that sound?
I absolutely would like to do that.
But so that was all sort of expected, those positive genetic correlations with psychiatric traits. But then we saw this entirely different panel of genetic correlations with BMI, with leptin, with type 2 diabetes. But these genetic correlations were in the opposite direction. So what that means is some of the same genes that increase your risk of developing anorexia nervosa actually decrease your risk of developing obesity or decrease your risk of developing type 2 diabetes. And these correlations were just as strong as those psychiatric correlations, but in the other direction. So just looking at that panel, you could not ignore the metabolic piece. So you absolutely have to, on a genetic and a biological level, say that anorexia nervosa is a metabo-psychiatric illness.
How would we explain that? Aside from realizing there's this correlation, any potential explanation at this point?
That's the next step. Now we need to go in and dig and figure out exactly what those genes are and what they do. So what are the genes or the gene pathways, for example, that might lead someone to not develop obesity? And I'm going to weave myself back into that negative energy balance piece now and actually find negative energy balance to be pleasant. Right? So that's where I'm thinking we're going to find that connection. But first, we need bigger sample sizes because we're actually still far behind a lot of the other psychiatric disorders. We have like 30,000 people with anorexia, and I think depression has 1 million now, right? So we have to make up some ground in order to catch up with the other disorders.
But if we wanted to understand what's going on, the key seems to be that the person who's predisposed to anorexia has that drive to not eat because of the feeling of stability, some sort of positive psychiatric experience. Yeah.
In fact, we did a study recently where we tried to understand this, and we took 10 people who had like the highest genetic risk for anorexia nervosa and 10 people who also had anorexia, but they had lower genetic risk because everybody who has the illness isn't equally as at high risk. And we interviewed them about what it felt like to have the illness. And they were blind. The interviewers were blind to whether these were the high or low genetic risk people. And of course, we didn't tell the patients themselves where they were. And we found substantial differences. So the people who were at high genetic risk could explain that. They could say, I just had like the first time I stepped into negative energy balance, it was like a eureka. It was like, wow, this feels good.
So the feeling of negative energy balance is you're hungry, but there's a feeling of excitement. Now, can I just posit a theory about this? We know that when a person is negative energy balance, they're hungry, their stress response goes up because the body is recognizing that they're in energy deficit and that's stressful. We got to get food. And attached to that stress is a dopamine response because dopamine motivates the person to get out there and do something. So could it not be that they're actually experience a dopamine flush?
Or the opposite, or it takes more for them to. But I think question is, does starvation give them a dopamine rush, right?
Yes, exactly.
We actually have some data on that are going to be coming out soon as well to see if their responses to brief periods of food deprivation are different than people who don't have anorexia. So again, I'm talking about this interview next year where we're going to have lots to talk about.
Okay. Does that not mean that is why some people who use intermittent fasting, or prolonged fasting, not even intermittent, but prolonged, they may actually be experiencing some of this. They may have some level of this anorexic behavior within the context of fasting. It's still energy balance. So Could we be looking at a similar phenomena there?
No, I think you have a good point. And some people describe that sort of almost as a starvation euphoria.
Yes.
And, whether those are endorphins or dopamine or some combination, we don't know. Or if it's actually a survival mechanism, if it's a way to keep us foraging when we're still hungry and there's not enough food. I mean, the body probably has all sorts of mechanisms that we don't even know about yet that try to keep us in energy balance to keep ourselves alive.
All right, well, we'll save those questions for another
next year.
But to getting back to anorexic, so is there more that you can say about metabolic? I mean, this connection between diabetes and...
I think that the one thing that I will add, and I think it's super important, and I say this to patients and to families all the time, is even after someone has recovered from anorexia nervosa, and of course that word in and of itself is complicated, but I always say for the rest of your life, you need to guard against falling into negative energy balance again, because it is like a whirlpool for you. And like I had, one person who had anorexia who told me starvation is my heroin. And that's not heroin with an E. It's without the E. It's like, it's my drug. And that is back to your point as well. And just looking into that sort of like abyss saying, I could do that again if I wanted to, I think is just such a high risk thing for these folks to face in the future.
You are speaking our language here. And what we would say in our community is, well, you have to restrict that behavior. But my understanding about the eating disorder paradigm is that there's a focus on non-restricting, on everything has to be in moderation, including eating behaviors. So where do you stand on that?
I think I stand on the side of whatever works for the individual. This is something that I've believed forever. It's like we do our clinical trials, we have our evidence-based treatments of choice, and that's wonderful. But we don't have a single evidence-based treatment of choice that works for everyone. And therefore, we need to make sure we keep the doors open for people that need something else that works for them. Their biology might be different. Their psychology may be different. And if someone needs to take an abstinence approach or needs to take an avoidance approach in order to stay safe and well, then more power to them. Do it.
Might that be the explanation for the high rates of recidivism in eating disorders, that lack of flexibility that you're talking about right now?
Lack of flexibility in terms of treatments?
Yeah. What you're proposing is, I think, fairly radical from the traditional paradigm.
I think a lot of clinicians would agree with me. I hope they would, because it's like, sometimes I'll speak in two different ways. One is that I might have someone go through cognitive behavioral therapy once and they're just not ready for it. And if they come back 3 or 4 years later, they might be in a place where they're more receptive. But on the other hand, that just might not be right for them. And then we do need to look at other approaches. And I think waiting those 2 or 3 years until they're ready might not necessarily be a good idea, because that makes them exposed to eating disorders behaviors for another 3 or 4 years, which in and of itself has long-term consequences on their health.
So what would you attribute to the high rates of recidivism in eating disorders?
So I'm going to have to break it down by disorder. I think for anorexia, it's because we don't have any medications that are helpful. B, I think we re-nourish people. So we don't get them up to a body mass index that gives them enough of a buffer from dropping into negative energy balance again.
Right.
And I'm going to blame the insurance companies here in the United States about that, because often they're kicking them out of treatment too early. And if you look globally, programs that can keep people in and re-nourish them to a higher BMI do better in terms of relapse.
Let me ask you, it's the genetics predisposes the person, but just simply the energy deficit can predispose a person as well, correct?
Sure, and it can trigger relapse.
Yeah. I'm just thinking now about those studies for like concentration camp survivors and their energy deficit was so low that they developed eating disorders.
Yep.
So you can do that just based on that.
You can't. I mean, those studies are amazing. And I just remember devouring them when I was early in the field, reading every single line saying, my God, this is so fascinating. These people have developed eating disorders.
Right.
Yeah.
So if you have an eating disorder, all the worse if you then go into energy deficit.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
I guess you're saying then in terms of more successful treatment, especially for the more vulnerable because of the genetics, you have to make sure that they're always at a certain level of nutritional status.
Exactly. And I would probably say that that's true across the board. with bulimia and binge eating disorder as well. And if just taking a moment on binge eating disorder, we see this circadian shift in eating in people with binge eating disorder often, where the binging happens in late afternoon and evening, and then they wake up in the morning with what I call a food hangover, and they're not hungry, and they skip breakfast, and then they skip lunch, and then they have a stressful day, and then they get home at 4 or 5 o'clock, and then they're famished. And, making sure that they're having their regular healthy meals at regular times is critical for long-term wellness, because if there's one thing our bodies love, it's predictability.
Mm-hmm. Again, we're on the same page. Yeah, we definitely agree with that. Now, I'm really intrigued about this connection between the metabolic disorders like diabetes and like that inverse relationship that you mentioned.
Yeah, it's interesting because I made mistakes early on. And I remember saying, and in fact, I still have an old slide that said that people who are constitutionally thin are not at risk for developing anorexia nervosa because they never have to go on a diet. And as it turns out, that's not 100% correct, because some of those folks are actually teetering on negative energy balance frequently and easily descend into anorexia nervosa. Now, interestingly, from what we know about genome-wide association studies of constitutional thinness, is the genes for anorexia and constitutional thinness aren't the same. It looks like there actually are differences there. And I think, I talked about these two quadrants, the metabolic quadrant and the psychiatric quadrant. In constitutional thinness, we see that metabolic quadrant, but we don't see the psychiatric quadrant. And I think that's the separator between those two things.
How can we make use of this clinically?
Right now, I think what can we do right now, and then what can we do in the future? And the right now, what we have found clinically is talking to patients about this, talking to parents and partners about this, sort of like just removes the clouds from their eyes. And they're like, oh my God, this makes so much sense. This absolutely jives with what I'm experiencing. Parents will say, I can tell when my child just gets right below her energy balance needs because it's like a switch and she becomes someone else or he becomes someone else.
Anorexic, you mean?
Yeah. And that's the metabolic part. And they will say their personality changes. And in fact, that's what they see. And that is why we try so hard to make sure they don't go down that path again. Yeah. So now it's actually helping parents and patients understand, first off, what's causing it. It's reducing blame with parents, and it's also making them feel heard, because they've been saying this to their doctors and their dietitians forever. And they're like, yeah, sure. But now it's like, oh, you're right. That's actually, there's something going on metabolically there that's changing. Your daughter's everything, or your son's everything.
Would the daughter themselves know when they're not in energy deficit, when they're actually normal? Would they recognize, hey, I'm stable, I'm not the person I am when I'm hungry?
Yeah, it's so interesting when people recover. They can tell the difference, but there's something blinding about it.
Yes, this is my addiction.
Yeah, I know. I had someone who she had been recovered for like 10 years, and she had to travel like across a bunch of time zones for a funeral. And intellectually, she knew she was at risk because she was depressed because of the death. She wasn't eating. She was in time zone chaos. But then when she hit that, it just sucked her down. And she lost the objectivity that she needed to get herself back on path.
Okay. All right. So how can we make use of this clinically? So giving information to parents and clients makes them feel a lot better. That's great. And the next thing is that the clinician would make sure that the person's eating a healthy food plan. And can we get here into what type of foods are we talking about? Would you agree, you being a very informed eating disorder specialist, that avoiding ultra-processed foods is a good idea because of the fact that they're not nutritionally sound?
I do. 100%.
You would not be somebody that would say, let's normalize eating junk food.
No.
Okay.
No, because I think we do need to re-nourish patients.
Yes.
We do need energy-dense foods, because otherwise they have to eat like mountains of food in order to be re-nourished, because it takes a lot of calories to re-nourish someone. But I think, and I will sort of say this comfortably, that ultra-processed foods mess with our biological homeostasis, both biologically and psychologically.
Yes.
And I didn't think you would disagree with that.
No, definitely not. No. Yeah. Okay. Now, what about the person who says, okay, I'm not going to eat that stuff? And now I know there's this new diagnosis of avoidant restrictive food intake.
Yeah.
How do we avoid that? Can you tell us what
that's
that
a
is?
totally different thing.
Okay. Tell us what it is.
Yeah. So avoidant restrictive food intake disorder came into the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistic Manual, in 2013, but the disorder's been around for a long time under different guises. And basically it is not just children, and many people think this is just a child's disorder, but we actually have a couple papers that are coming out now on over 3,000 adults with ARFID. And one way to think about it is extreme picky eating. But there are 3 different presentations. So one of them is picky eating due to sensory sensitivity. So someone who just gets grossed out by the texture or the smell or the mouthfeel of certain foods. So they have a really limited number of foods that they eat. The second presentation, and these are overlapping, so they're not mutually exclusive, is low appetite or disinterest in food. This one might be a little bit more related to depression because, as we know, depression is also associated with often loss of appetite. And then the third one is fear of negative consequences. And this is usually someone who might have had an experience with like choking or even seeing someone else choke. And so they've become like super panicky about choking themselves. And so they restrict their eating to safe foods. But this can lead to weight loss. It can lead to lots of nutritional problems. But interestingly, it happens across the BMI spectrum as well, because some people will only eat certain fairly high caloric and maybe even ultra processed foods. So again, I think we learn so much over time, but for ARFID, we need to look at people of all ages and people of all sizes because it shows up all over the place.
When the person who says, I won't touch any carbs at all and has that kind of a reaction, you wouldn't say that's some version of this condition.
I would not say that's some version of this, because I'm just trying to think, unless they fall into one of those 3 categories, like if for some reason they think that carbs feel different and they get really freaked out by that feeling. No, but that sounds more like someone who's just choosing not to eat a certain
And it
food
wouldn't
group.
fit into the orthorexia as well?
Well, orthorexia, now you're going to get me started on that. Orthorexia isn't a real diagnosis. It doesn't show up in our, library of diagnoses. People have been pushing for it, and it actually has different meanings in different countries, which is part of the problem. So in the United States, and maybe in Canada too, it is people who are just really focused on organic, healthful foods. And, that in and of itself isn't necessarily a problem until it starts interfering with your life. In Sweden, curiously, it means people who have the exercise form, like exercise bulimia, I think people used to call it. So it's not a universal term yet that has made its way into the diagnostic nomenclature.
Okay. You mentioned the idea of bookending metabolic syndrome, anorexia being one end and bulimia being the other. Did you want to say anything about that concept?
Yeah, actually, I think I'm going to just rephrase it a little bit and then I'll say something about it. So I think where we're going, and we have some evidence on this now, is, we have this group of disorders that we call eating disorders. And it's anorexia, bulimia, binge eating disorder, and ARFID. And one of the things that we're trying to do is use genetics to understand how those disorders fit together biologically. Do they fit together biologically?
Yes.
And what we're seeing so far is that on the psychiatric side, we see some of those similar genetic correlations with depression, with anxiety, anorexia more with OCD. And, our prediction is that we're going to see more of an association with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder and with substance use disorders or addictions with the bulimia and binge eating disorder part. But all of that, there will be a psychiatric genetic component. But I think where the differences are going to come between some of these disorders is in that metabolic and anthropometric piece. Okay. We're going to see that even those negative correlations are going to persist with anorexia, but they're going to be positive with bulimia and binge eating disorder. So they're going to have a positive genetic correlation between bulimia or binge eating disorder and type 2 diabetes and obesity and high BMI. So it's like they share psychiatric underpinnings, but they diverge metabolically.
I find that interesting. And I don't know, how could we figure that out biologically? Why would that happen?
Yeah, well,
the evolutionary advantage to that.
No. It's like, that's a great question. And hopefully we'll have the data to answer that soon as our sample sizes get larger and larger. But we also know, for example, and this goes back to the question of how could we actually use this information clinically?
Yeah.
And for example, we know that about 50% of people who have anorexia nervosa at some point during the course of their illness cross over to have bulimia nervosa. And if we can actually look at their genetic profiles early on and say, are you at higher risk for developing bulimia? We might change the way we treat them and become more vigilant for those signs of emerging binge eating, right? So I think there's clinical utility way beyond just letting parents and patients know that there is a genetic component. I think these genetic risk scores will be very useful clinically, not genetic tests. We are not trying to develop a genetic test for anorexia or bulimia. In fact, that makes no sense because it's a combination of genes and environment, and no genetic test will ever capture all those environmental factors, right? But it might help us understand more about, do they have a high likelihood of developing a severe and enduring course? Do they have a high likelihood of converting to bulimia? And how can we change our management clinically to address, it's really personalized intervention based on your genetic profiles is where we're going with this work.
And this idea of bookending, another way to say that is it's a continuum of behavior.
Right, exactly. And a continuum of genetic risk as well.
Yes. So let me just back up. So the person who is genetically predisposed for anorexia is less likely to have type 2 diabetes.
Yeah.
So, and the person who has type 2 diabetes is less likely to become, would it be the opposite as well? Anorexic.
I've actually never seen that done. We could do it. If I could go and look at like the biggest genome-wide association study that's been done for type 2 diabetes and then see if they've done genetic correlations with anorexia. I don't know if they have or not. That's a great question.
Because I bet if you ask the people with type 2 diabetes, hey, let's go on a fast, they're going to say no.
Yeah, that's not going to be attractive to them, right?
Because a lot of people with type 2 diabetes we identify them as having food addiction. Not all, of course.
Yeah.
A subpopulation.
Yeah.
And food addicts have a really hard time with fasting. And other people have no problem. They love it. They thrive on it. Maybe it's because of that predisposition to anorexic behavior. But you won't likely find that with food addiction. I don't know, Chrissy, have you had that? What's your experience?
I was going to say, I'm really excited to hear a little bit more about binge eating, your work with binge eating disorder and bulimia, because I think those are what we see a lot of those similar clients that fit on that ED spectrum with the food addiction spectrum. So I'm excited to hear more about that.
And I can tell you that because I've interviewed a few people from my book, I wanted to interview people who are classically diagnosed with eating disorder and if a food addiction platform helped for them. And oftentimes what they really thrived on is exactly what you said, was the structure of 3 meals a day. And they could not let go of that because if they did, using your words, they go into energy deficit and get into trouble. But if they did this structure and ate enough non-sugar, basically unprocessed food, they thrived. So I don't know if it was actually the food addiction platform itself or the reason for it, but it was the same treatment essentially.
Yeah. And I think, again, I don't think we have to pull these things completely apart. Like I sort of see this overlapping Venn diagram with binge eating disorder, with loss of control eating, with food addiction. And there's this space where they all converge. And, people are, trying to, how do we pull them apart? And how do we make this? And it's like, I don't think you're gonna, because I think they just biologically and psychologically overlap. And again, it goes back to the very first thing that we talked about. It's finding what works for whom.
I have to admit, I don't know if the word is mistaken, I've been biased towards the idea that the eating disorder clinicians are focused mainly on not the food, but on the psychological, the very myths that you were saying that we believed. It's because of poor coping, it's because of environmental stresses of the past, not that it's a biological phenomena, that it's something psychological. And that the new thinking is, no, we have to pay attention to the foods themselves as well. So we've always said it's important to know is the person in front of us somebody who's suffering from an eating disorder? Because then the focus should be psychological, versus is it somebody who's a food addict? Then the focus is on what they're putting into their mouth. What do you say about that?
I think we need to look at both of them. I think we need to look at both the food that they're putting into their mouth and the psychology. But they're just, you can't disentwine them. I don't even know if that's a word, but you can't pull them apart.
It might not even be necessary to know then.
Right. But it will lead you perhaps to the right path more quickly if you figure out which is prominent for them. And I think one of the things that's happened in eating disorders historically is there's been this split between the psychologist and the dietitian. And the dietitian focused on the food and the psychologist did the psychology, and, who knows what happens in between that space. But that has never been my approach. And, I think from the very beginning, especially with binge eating disorder, my focus was always on, when you're eating, what you're eating, and the fact that your body wants to know when it's coming. So, but it's interesting to me, Vera, that you have had that perception of the eating disorders field.
Yeah, I'm happy to be corrected. I'm really happy that you're telling me that this is of the past.
Maybe I'm too optimistic, but I think, a lot of the folks that I work with, especially I think this has sort of come out of family-based treatment for eating disorders as well, where the parents take control and basically are in charge of refeeding the child. And, in that situation, it's all about the food and getting the parents to make sure that they renourish their children adequately. So I think maybe that was where the turning point in eating disorders was.
Okay, in that refeeding, that there would be attention to the person gaining weight, improving the energy deficit. If that required eating sugary, fatty foods, doesn't matter because we want to gain that weight. Whereas we would say, we don't want to reintroduce, especially to a vulnerable person, because they're vulnerable in that energy deficit. We don't want to introduce an addictive food. What do you say to that? Would you caution that?
I think there's got to be a balance. Like, we do not want to re-nourish people with, ultra highly processed foods. That's not going to get us anywhere. And it doesn't set them up well cardio-metabolically for the future either. And I think this is something that we talk about all the time is like, we do not want someone to come out of treatment for anorexia with high cholesterol. And in fact, they are at risk for high cholesterol anyhow, which we don't completely understand.
Another metabolic thing.
Exactly. So, and I think, I've looked at so many different ways, and I've thought about this, and I've never found the right person to talk to, but I wanted to figure out how does NASA feed their astronauts? It's like, what other sorts of healthful ways can we use to re-nourish our patients that are less distressing? Because right now it is really hard for patients to be renourished. And part of that gets into the whole, gut microbiome conversation, but like they have so much gas and they have so much stomach pain, and, they're eating 4,000, 4,500 calories a day. And that's a lot of food, especially if they're not moving around. And so, my question has always been, how can we make renourishment less agonizing for them? So,
Ask a food addict if they can have 4,000 calories. They're all over it.
Right. I know. But isn't it interesting, just the human diversity and just how different people's bodies are when it comes to along these dimensions? It's just cool.
Do you find that in the person with an eating disorder, once they are in energy healthy state, that their sense of body dysmorphia also diminishes, or does that stay?
That's a great question. It's the last to go.
It's the last to go.
It's so, and I always think about Richard Simmons. He talked about, I have two examples. So one is Richard Simmons was large, the exercise guy, and then he lost a lot of weight, and he said he still navigated the world as if he were a large person. So it takes a while for that body image to catch up with changes. And like my own experience, I remember after pregnancy, I still sort of walked around as if I had a baby in my belly. So I think there's something about cognitively and perceptually it taking longer to change your perception of your body size. But that can be one of sort of the last pillars of the eating disorder that's hard to treat.
Would it be fair to say then, when we have people sitting in front of us with disordered eating, they could be in that muddle in between, and that really the real difference is that energy deficit is the part at which the person slips into the anorexic behavior. But that could happen with addiction too.
I think that is highly likely. And an example that I often give patients with bulimia and binge eating disorder is I need to eat regularly. And if I don't, I get very irritable. And I know that if I'm that hungry, I want something that will get to my brain fast. And the example I always give is frozen yogurt. It's like, I know that frozen yogurt will get my brain functioning right away. But I can imagine a situation in where that sort of like repeated paradigm could become addictive.
Yeah.
But it is definitely the energy deficit that makes me think I need something like that now.
Yeah.
And fast. So yes, I think negative energy balance could absolutely play a role in food addiction as well.
Yeah, a lot of people with food addiction have a long history of extreme dieting.
Yeah.
The first diet, they didn't have an obsession with food, but after that first diet, they did. And each time they went on a diet, it just seemed to get worse and worse.
It reinforces it. Yep.
Yeah. Wow. We're talking about the same population, it seems.
Yeah, it's so interesting. And again, there are these Venn diagrams. Like, I'm sure there are people in your world who have food addiction who don't overlap that much with the eating disorders world. And I think we have some patients with really severe anorexia nervosa who are in some ways the opposite of your food addiction patients. But then there's this muddle in the middle where people really overlap, and they overlap differentially over time.
Over time, yes.
And I think that's what you were talking about as well. It's like, just because someone has something at one cross-sectional moment doesn't going to mean they're the same thing the next year or 5 years or 10 years. So we need to think developmentally.
I also find it can go like eating disorder or food addiction and then switch to substance use disorder. Then they heal the substance use disorder, and then the eating disorder or food addiction gets long and prominent. So a lot of the clients that I work with are in 10, 15 years of recovery from usually alcohol use disorder and food. Food was a thing, and then they started drinking and food is back again.
Yep. And they're bouncing back and forth between the different treatment programs because we don't have enough dual diagnosis programs. And this gets me a little bit sad because I've been saying this for like 100 years. It's like, we really need to have more programs that just do both at the same time.
Yes.
And they just don't exist.
That's why I wanted to speak with you. So what's a clinician to do? Give us some tips here, because we're in the muddle, right?
Yeah. I mean, I think we have to create our own path. We need to find somebody to work with so that we've got someone looking at the addiction, someone looking at the eating disorders, and they're actually collaborating. And if it is alcohol as well, instead of saying, now you got to get that fixed first before I touch you, right? Which is usually what people hear. And then the ping pong thing starts happening. So, but I mean, I've got some junior people who have come along this is their area. They are focused on this intersection between addictions and eating disorders, but they're not developing clinical programs. They're doing genetics, or they're doing animal research, or whatever that might be. And it's like, how long is it going to take before someone does this?
Yeah, we get some clinical strategies.
Right.
How are you finding your approach, which to my mind seems very radical? How has the eating disorder community adjusted or responded to your research?
It's been slow and then all at once. I mean, in the beginning, when we did the first twin study, saying that there was a genetic component, you would think that we were just like, really ready to be, just absolutely sent out in some boat somewhere and put on a float and not touch. And people did not love it, because we were changing paradigms. Yes. We were saying we need to think about this in a different way. And people are always resistant to change. But then I think we just kept pecking and pecking and pecking and pecking with more and more data and more evidence and more whatever, to the point where people can't ignore it anymore. And like I said, even these folks who are dyed-in-the-wool sociocultural theorists are like, genetics play a role too. So it's people understand that it can't be ignored.
Oh, I just love that it decreases the shame as an individual who's like in recovery too, because there is that also biological drive that keeps them still performing the behavior, which, often the parents can't understand. Nobody around them can understand. And again, that's so similar to addiction, right? It's like, they're like, just eat, or they're like, just stop drinking. It's like the same, thing that you're dealing with at the same time. And just like reduces the shame of feeling like, I don't know why I can't stop, because it's what I hear. It's what I experience myself personally, but also what I hear from almost every client that I work with.
And it allows people to be more empathic.
Yeah.
And I think that's part of it, instead of just putting up that wall and, like you said, saying eat more, eat less, whatever. It's like, ooh, this really is a struggle for them. And I always say that recovery from an eating disorder is an uphill battle against your biology. And that seems to really help parents and partners understand that this isn't just, they're not just being stubborn. They're not just being willful. They're really fighting. They're struggling.
Well, and it normalizes like relapses as well.
Yeah.
Which I think, people think, oh, well, you had the solution. Like, what happened? Did you just stop using your tools? Like, that is just so shaming behavior. And, when we hear that, we hear it in the addiction world. And I've worked with eating disorder clients, and they're like with, people who just are like, I'm trying to use my tools, but there's this drive bigger than me that sets me back. And I love you describe that like negative energy balance in this place where, it's almost like that. They cross this threshold and they lose sight of everything that they were headed for in the past. So, so beautiful.
It would be fair to say then that there's no cure. I will say with food addiction, you can be a food addict in remission, but actually there's no cure. So you have to be ever vigilant.
I absolutely tell people that they have to be ever vigilant. And I say this is part of your health legacy. The example that I use all the time is I broke my back when I was younger, and I'm healthy now and I'm active, but I know if I do something wrong, my back's going to start hurting again and I might end up in bed for a while. And I'm like, that's your eating disorder. Even if you consider yourself to be recovered and people can use whatever language they feel is best for them, you still have to watch out for a negative energy balance. You still have to watch out for skipping meals because this is part of your health legacy and you have to respect it. Just like I have to respect my back. And people are like, oh, okay, all right, I get it. And it's like, I don't do the mind-body thing, so I don't find a difference between a back injury versus a metabopsychiatric disorder. And I think that actually helps people too, the old, oh, it's all in your head thing. It's like, your head, your body, they're one. Stop doing that separation thing.
The people who do follow the it's all in your head will often use models like the intuitive eating. So just eat as you feel appropriate. In the addiction world, we would say that doesn't exist in the world of ultra-processed food. It might with real food, but not with ultra-processed food. What do you say?
But also with people whose hunger and satiety signals have been erased or dampened, how can they eat intuitively?
Right. Yeah, that's what we say too. You see, now here's an example of where I assumed that the intuitive eating model was something that the eating disorder paradigm, that's one of their major tools.
I think one of the things to think about is that the eating disorders world is not a monolith.
Yeah.
There might be some people there who think that still, but there are plenty of us who acknowledge the fact that the signals are erased and you can't follow them if they're not there.
Right. Okay, good. So although you can't say much about it now, can you tell me a little bit about where you stand on the whole concept of food addiction? I'm really keen to know more about bulimia, but what can you say now about your understanding of food addiction or your embrace of that concept?
Interestingly, one of the things that I've found is that men who have issues with binge eating, loss of control eating, food addiction are much more comfortable using that term than they are using eating disorders terms. And I don't know if it's because eating disorders have this long track record of being women's disorders, or if the concept actually jives with them more. It doesn't matter to me. If it allows them to say something's out of control and I need help, go for it. I think my pragmatic self always wins when it comes to getting people help. So I think the way to ask, if you ask me, do I embrace food addiction? I think I'm going to go back to that Venn diagram of binge eating, food addiction, loss of control eating, and all the other terms that they have had. And I think they all overlap. But I also think that there is specificity in food addiction as well. So it's not just a messy mush. Like I said, I do think that there really are people for whom that is the driving issue and needs to be addressed in order for them to become well.
And vice versa for eating disorders.
Yeah.
The unfortunate thing is our tool, the Yale Food Inventory, is a great tool in terms of being sensitive. It will pick it up, but it's not very good at being specific.
Exactly.
Not separate. And we need to get a better tool.
Or we might never, because we can't. that might be part of it too. And I think we find that with ARFID, like lots of people with anorexia score high on the ARFID measures. And I think it's because of that overlap that we're having trouble pulling them apart.
I am so excited to have you back. This whole conversation has made me so excited because, again, I think probably in the field that you're working in and the eating disorder clinicians, even that we're talking to, are very aligned with you. And it's some of the eating disorder, probably people that aren't so aligned, that in that messaging that we see that we get disheartened by. But you have just been brought so much hope and I don't know. Yeah, I would say the biggest thing is hope that we can start to work together so that people are getting the best level of treatment for whatever they're showing up with.
Yeah, that's why I wasn't going to let you get away.
That's lovely. We all need hope right now. We all need hope. So I'm glad there was a little bit of that today.
I'm really hopeful that you will come back when you have your information on bulimia and binge eating disorder fleshed out more.
I'd love to.
Yeah. So usually our question next is what's next for you, but I guess that's what's next for you.
That's what's next for us. Yes. In fact, it'll be pretty soon. So hopefully, we'll have something within the next couple of months that I'll be able to talk about some more.
Okay.
Amazing. We do have one signature question. And so it is, if you could tell a younger version of yourself something about eating disorders, metabolic disease, what would it be?
It would be pay more attention to biology. I drank the Kool-Aid when I was younger. When I think about the first lectures I gave on eating disorders, it was about families and it was about sociocultural stuff. Yeah. And then, when I look back on that, I'm like, I'm so sorry to every single undergraduate that I ever taught that to, right? It's like, but that's what I would tell her.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for being here today.
It's been great. Thank you both for your excellent questions.
Yeah, I think that our community will be really happy to hear this talk.
Wonderful. Okay, take care.
Thanks for joining us this week on Food Junkies Recovery from Food Addiction. Make sure to join our Facebook group, Sugar Free for Life Support Group, I'm Sweet Enough. Molly and Clarrisa are food addiction professionals who offer one-to-one counseling and group coaching through Sweet Sobriety. Please subscribe to our show so you never miss an episode. While you're at it, if you found value in today's episode, we'd appreciate you leaving us a review on your favorite platform. Your feedback helps grow our show and allows us to reach others who need to hear this message of recovery. Don't forget to pick up a copy of Dr. Tarman's book, Food Junkies. And as Vera always says, the power is ours.